Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm going to start talking about an undesigned coincidence, what I consider to be an undesigned coincidence, between two of the Synoptic Gospels in a passage that is similar among all three of the Synoptic Gospels. So this is the first time I've done one that is exactly like this in this series, 2023 series. The first one I talked about was between John and the Synoptics. The next one I talked about was between Matthew and Luke, but the two passages in question were not similar to one another, even though it was two Synoptic Gospels. And then for this one, I'm going to be taking sort of the toughest of all, which is a case where you actually have essentially the same parable told in approximately the same place in Jesus' ministry and so forth in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And yet there are variations, and I think that two of the variations fit together pretty well as question and answer, or puzzle and explanation, whatever terms you want to use. There's going to be some setup here, so I'm going to do that today to keep this from getting to be too long. So the parable in question is the parable of the vineyard, told apparently during Holy Week, in other words, shortly before Jesus' crucifixion. In passing, I'll just mention that you'll often hear from critics for some reason that Jesus' crucifixion was caused by his cleansing the temple. And this will be used as an argument against two temple cleansings, because they'll say, but if he'd cleansed the temple 3 years before, then he would have been crucified 3 years before. Very, very speculative and I think implausible. And what's interesting is that this parable is explicitly said to be a reason why the leaders were seeking to seize him. Then there are other reasons. I mean, he annoyed them in many different ways, but more so even than the temple cleansing. And there's no indication that this parable had been told in Jerusalem at any earlier time. So we need to pay attention to what the documents actually say, not just our own theories. But this parable occurs in Matthew 21, beginning at verse 33. It occurs in Mark 12, beginning at the first verse of Mark 12, and then it occurs in Luke 20, beginning at verse 9. Now, the thing about this, and I'm just going to say this right up front, the wording is remarkably similar in all three of the accounts of this parable. So once again, when we advocate undesigned coincidences, this doesn't mean that we're unaware of the similarities among the Synoptic Gospels. The fact that it occurs in all three means that it's what's called triple tradition material, meaning that it occurs in Matthew and Mark and Luke. And I fully admit that the reading, that when you read it, you see very similar wording in different parts. It's not all identical by any means, and I'll come to that in a moment. But if you just look at Matthew 21:33, there was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. All right. Mark 12, a man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a vat under the winepress and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. Okay. Luke 20, verse 9, a man planted a vineyard and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey for a long time. So Luke's is a little shorter. And there were Old Testament passages in which God made an analogy between the nation of Israel and a vineyard, so for sure Jesus is picking up on that here. And there are other verses where you could read the parallel verses and they would be very similar in wording like that. So this is taken to support the notion of some kind of literary dependence. Most often it's supposed to be, Mark is writing, and then Luke and Matthew having access to Mark and using it for some of their wording. I don't disagree with that. That could very well be what happened. It could very well be the case that Luke and Matthew had access to Mark and were partially copying Mark, using some of Mark's wording. The fact remains, though, that there are differences as well. Critics not only admit that, they make use of it. They will use it to argue for theological changes, deliberate redaction, and so forth. So the differences are as undeniable as the similarities. Just to take one sort of trivial example, Matthew in verse 34 and 35 kind of lumps the slaves together. So the man who planted the vineyard, he sends his slaves to try to collect the rent, basically, which would have been given in the form of some of the produce of the vineyard. And then they're beaten. So it's just, he sent his slaves to receive his produce. And the vine growers took his slaves and beat one and killed another and stoned a third. Whereas in Mark, it's it kind of draws it out a little more. So he sends one slave, they took him, beat him, sent him away. Another slave, they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. Sent another, and they killed him. And then it says, and so with many others, beating some and killing others. And in Matthew, then he sends another group of slaves in verse 36. So, the exact situation with the slaves is worded somewhat differently. Very often, changes of this kind are said to have literary or theological reasons for them. And when it's assumed that Matthew has redacted Mark, they'll try to give, some theological or literary reason for it. I would submit that the way Mark tells it is actually kind of more interesting as a story. If you're telling a child the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, you don't tell about her coming and sitting in a chair and then say, and she did something similar with some porridge and then a bed and some beds and then they found her in the beds. Like you don't kind of rush through that, right? You go through each separate thing, right? She tried daddy bears and she tried mama bears and then she tried baby bears and it was just right. And you do it each time, right? That's the way an experienced storyteller does things. And so I suspect that Mark's there is closer to the way that Jesus really did it, taking his time over it a little bit more. And then Matthew is speeding it up a little bit, but not because that makes it literarily better. Okay, so the idea that these are always improvements, or they always have some heavy point to it, is dubious. It's questionable, and I want to put that in there because the critical scholarly approach to these things is to take the similarities to be the result of careful copying and the differences to be the result of careful redacting without any additional factual input, without any differences of memory. And since the differences are as undeniable as the similarities, it doesn't seem to me that is really an objective conclusion. After all, we know that when people remember things, they tend to remember things a little bit differently. When they tell things, they're going to paraphrase in the real sense of paraphrase, not in the sense of paraphrase that sometimes gets used where, I thirst is a so-called paraphrase of, my God, why have you forsaken me? And like, those don't sound the same at all, okay? But in this case, as when Matthew kind of rushes through the slaves, okay? And there are plenty of others. And so these could result from a combination of, yeah, you know, you have this text, you're going to partly use it, you're going to partly copy it, but then also you remember it slightly differently, or you're talking to someone who remembers it slightly differently. And I think the assumption must be something along these lines. Well, if they had a witness who had seen Jesus tell this story, or if the author himself had seen Jesus tell this story, he's not going to use a literary source at all. He's only going to use his memory. And I think that deserves to be challenged. An assumption like that is something that you ought to bring out and say, why should I think that? So I can easily imagine Matthew having been there, okay, and hearing Jesus tell it. But if it's even been 10 years later, much less 20 years, you know, whatever, if it's been years later, and Mark has been talking to Peter and has been writing this down, and it's available, why not? Why not open it up? Why not read it? And say, oh yeah, you know, it went like this, it went like that. Okay, you know, I remember a little bit differently at this point. Now, a difference along these lines is the fact that after Jesus tells this story, they kill the heir and so forth, you can read it, then Jesus says, what will the owner of the vineyard do? This is Mark 12:9. He will come and destroy the vine growers and will give the vineyard to others. So Mark records Jesus answering his own question. And Luke records Jesus answering his own question, in that sense similar to Mark. But Matthew, it's a little bit different, okay? Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine growers? So Matthew 21:41, they said to him, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper season. So the crowd answers it. And this is seen, you know, as a contradiction, and therefore as a source of non-factual redaction. And the motive generally given for that is this idea, and sometimes this is considered an example of Matthean opposition to the Jews, that you have the people themselves say what should happen. And sort of similar to what Nathan the prophet does in the Old Testament. You know, he tells the story to David of the man who stole the other man's one ewe lamb and took it away from him and killed it. And David says, you know, that man should die. And then Nathan says, you are the man. So it's similar here in Matthew. Jesus asks what should happen. They say he's going to come and he's going to kill them and he's going to give the vineyard to someone else. And then Jesus says, he quotes a psalm, and then he says, therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and will be given to a nation producing the fruit of it. So that Jesus is behaving like Nathan. Now, first of all, I don't think these are really contradictory. In any real world situation, you could have multiple people speaking. And again, when we're using the notion of recognizable paraphrase, Jesus says, you know, what will he do? And you've got people calling out from the crowd, he's going to kill him. You know, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. And they're getting into the story. And if Jesus says something like, that's right, or that's exactly right, that's what's going to happen, right? Now, notice that's not the exact wording, but that would be tantamount to both of these things being said. Both the people answer the question and Jesus affirms their answer. It's funny, there's a New Testament scholar out there on Twitter. I don't remember his name. That's fine. He came upon my talking about this in one of my books. I think it was in Testimonies. And when he came to the part where I made that suggestion about both groups, you know, they speak up and say what the the man's going to do to the wicked tenants. And then Jesus is like, yeah, you're right. He said, she says she doesn't believe in verbatim, that it has to be verbatim recording, and she believes that it could be paraphrased, and yet this sounds like verbatim recording. And like, that just really surprises me, because explicitly what I'm saying is that it wouldn't be verbatim, that for Jesus to say, yes, you're right, that's what he'll do, okay, that isn't word for word Jesus saying he will bring them to a wretched end, etc. So I don't quite get that. And I think what that person must have meant was that in order to sort of qualify as making a sufficiently sophisticated use of the notion of paraphrase, it has to be a more radical departure from what was actually said. So that if you exercise your historical imagination in a way such that it could be recognizably what is recorded in both books, then that's not really acknowledging paraphrase enough. In order for you to acknowledge paraphrase, it has to be something that's weirder, farther away from what was really said. It can't be a form of harmonization. Well, too bad. But in fact, that suggestion that I'm making, it's a conjecture, is a paraphrase. It's, not word for word, but neither does it have to be super deliberate. All right, this is the way people think. If years later you're going to tell a story, as the theological blogger Steve Hayes once wrote, he wrote, memory is naturally paraphrastic. And I want to emphasize that it's naturally paraphrastic. It's not that you're thinking back and saying, well, this is what was really said, but I'm going to change that because I want to emphasize some theme or something. It's just naturally paraphrastic. So I don't think there's an actual contradiction there. And I also think that for Jesus to be a little bit like Nathan the prophet, and to kind of get them all into the story, and they say he's going to come and he's going to kill him. And Jesus is like, yeah, you're right about that. Guess what? Okay, that could be real. There's no reason why that needs to be a literary construction by Matthew. That could be the actual working of Jesus as a storyteller. Okay, now, I haven't even gotten to the undesigned coincidence. And as I see, we're almost at 18 minutes here on the counter. So that's why I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to finish next time. And I'm not even going to say, and you may have read it in the book, that's fine, but I'm not going to say where I think the undesigned coincidence comes in here. You can read over the next week the next few verses, or the accounts, the 3 accounts, and look at Matthew and Luke and see if you can figure out where I think there is an undesigned coincidence. But I wanted to set this up methodologically so that you can see how there can be both some literary dependence, no qualms about using something that's already been written, but also supplemented by memory, and why those two should not be artificially taken to be in contradiction. And then that does allow different aspects of the story that are told a little bit differently to explain one another, and we'll see next time how that might work. So come back for the rest of this exciting undesigned coincidence in the parable of the vine growers at the Lydia Migru channel.